My name is Kerich, and my thesis is titled Critical Breaking. The idea for this thesis comes from my interest in how people, artists especially, break or otherwise misuse systems. For the purposes of my thesis, I consider a break to be an unintentional or unexpected behavior from a system from the perspective of some invested party. The important things to take away there from that are that it's perspectival, it's based on a person's interpretation of it, and it's also not merely the negation of effect. It can be an unexpected behavior, at least for the purposes of my thesis. So in this thesis, I'm focused on instances of this breakdown can actually speak to or reveal many aspects of systems beyond the merely technical or formal aspects. Pictured here are pieces from Jody.org in the background, Super Mario Clouds on the left, and then an excerpt from the Friends Day video by Arigato on the right. I wanted to come up with a framework to better capture how artists like these and other people who use digital systems can break those digital systems, and how those instances of breaking can be deployed as critical analysis. I decided to call the framework critical breaking to emphasize the critical analysis aspect. Through analysis of the critical algorithm studies literature and feminist science studies, I further developed 3 key methods of critical breaking analysis: auditing systems, negotiating relationships with systems, and revealing the context of systems, when I'll run through each of them quickly to explain what I mean by them. Auditing systems. By this I mean discovering how a system works under certain criteria and why. This is especially prudent when the system itself is biased against a marginalized group, for example. Discovering embedded biases in systems has been a problem in studying digital systems for a long time, and many attempts have been made to quantify or taxonomize it. Niesenbaum and Friedman's 1996 Bias in Computer Systems is a good place to look if you want to see the beginnings of that. When information about how a system is built isn't made public, analysts are left little recourse but to develop creative methods to audit these systems. These methods, however, can be slow and costly. Reverse engineering is an example of that, and can frequently be made obsolete by updates to the system, especially relevant in networked and internet cases. I suggest critical breaking as a supplement to these things, emphasizing short-form, quick audits done through breaking, which can allow for rapid response in the moment, but do not hold over the totality of the system or in the long term. Negotiating relationships with systems is my second key analytic angle, and the most grim outlook on human-system relationships is most likely Deleuze's control society hypothesis, which basically states that all human actions will be subtly controlled and shaped by the systems we use, all while presenting an illusory idea of meaningful choice and agency. A more optimistic outlook comes from Alex Galloway's Tactical Media, the idea that through tactical media interventions, systems can be transformed to suit the needs of their users as opposed to the needs of their creators. The key question to answer here for me is how much of our relationship with systems is actually malleable and shiftable to our own needs, and how to locate and perform those shifts if they exist. And for the optimist, I situate critical breaking as a framework that can, through analysis of where and how systems break, help isolate and highlight those places and show us paths to eventually enacting those shifts. Thirdly, revealing the context of systems. In order to actually perform the breaking of a system, the system needs to actually exist materially, and this materiality gives it an embedding in the world. So this final broad category for analysis that is possible with critical breaking is highlighting and revealing and highlighting aspects of the context in which the system exists. For example, asking for whom a system is broken connects it to a web of perspective and expectation that reveals important information that is almost necessarily located outside of the system itself. Methods like these give critical breaking the analysis or the reach to be connected to the wider world while still remaining situated and focused on the system itself. So, to build out the concept of critical breaking, the main part of my thesis is composed of 3 case studies across 3 core chapters. In each, I examine a different kind of breaking of digital systems and compare it with my central core concept of critical breaking. I show what parts of these practices are useful or resonant breaking that should be incorporated into a critical breaking framework or practice, and which aspects are limitations that should be critiqued or pitfalls to avoid. My 3 case studies are speedrunning, software testing, and hacktivism. Each of these represents a different kind of breaking in different contexts. Speedrunning allows for a discussion of breaking games, an interesting area due both to the mostly closed nature of game systems, at least older games that are not regularly updated and won't change, and also games have effective and aesthetic values incorporated into them. Unlike many digital systems, games try to tell a story and have art direction, and those influence the ways in which they're broken. Software testing allows for a discussion of corporate breaking. This breaking is done for business reasons, and that has concrete implications on the methods and frameworks that they use. Notably, things like efficiency and accountability have changed software testing over its history in very compelling ways. While all breaking is at least a little bit political, activism is very political. It allows an exploration of how breaking techniques and tools hold up when they have a revolutionary or liberatory or decentralized ideological mandate. The coherence of politics across breaking tools and in breaking practice is the main focus of that chapter. Due to their difference, I relied on different methodology for investigating each of them, and I will describe that in their relative sections of this presentation. There was a lit review here that was very boring, and so you're welcome. I cut it for time. So my first case study is speedrunning. Speedrunning, for those of you who do not know, is a video game practice where a player attempts to achieve some objective in that video game as quickly as possible. Usually this involves using glitches or exploits in the game to save time. Across the globe, there are communities of speedrunners collaborating to find these kinds of glitches, compete for fastest times, and set up structured marathons where speedruns are showcased for an audience. Due to its relative newness, there is some, but not very much, literature on speedrunning. As such, the most productive investigative methods for me in this case study were interviews with speedrunners, on-site interviews, and on-site observation, and textual analysis of recorded speedruns, of which there are a lot. Most interviews I conducted were online, though some were also in person at SGQ, one of my research sites. SGQ, or Summer Games Done Quick, is one of the 2 largest charity speedrunning marathons in the United States. It takes place in Minneapolis and draws speedrunners from all over the world. My secondary site was Meme-a-thon 3, a just-for-fun, ironic speedrunning marathon where all the speedruns were deliberately bad or silly or compromised or just straight up unwatchable in some way. I also did some deep dives into specific speedrunning techniques, researching how and why they work in the various games in which they take place. In addition to all of this stuff, I also include a limited discussion of game art as an example of a different kind of breaking in a game's context. One of the works I discuss is something I made myself, Katamari Dreams, which I have a screenshot of there. So what did I find out? What are my conclusions? In my chapter, I went through a lot of different facets of speedrunning, including different ways to break games, some of the philosophical and organizational aspects of speedrunning communities, and importantly, speedrunning and counterplay. In my chapter, I compare speedrunning to Reed Deputer's idea of counterplay, which is basically the idea of playing against a system in a politically resistant way. Speedrunning fits counterplay definitionally in the micro sense. Individual breaks and glitches in the game can resist the way the game is coded on a moment-to-moment basis, but on the macro level, speedrunning is really just the ultimate fan activity. By way of explaining this, speedrunning is very respectful of and limited by broader game structure, like where a game begins and ends and the victory conditions of the game. Speedrunning has very close engagement with game systems and allows them to make really powerful impacts on the game systems that they speedrun, which I think is an important model for strong critical breaking. But their ultimate hang-up inside of game design precludes them from making critical statements about games more broadly than that. This high-level analysis is not something that speedrunners aspire to in their practice, I should say, but the structure of their practice also makes it impossible for them to do that, and that's important to note. In the case of doing critical breaking work, this should tell us that the goalposts or indicators of success for critical breaking should be extra systemic, if possible, to avoid a recapture by the system and stunting of analytic results as a result of that. Game art is an example of how this is possible, as aims of game art are generally meant to be experienced by a human audience and not meant to be analyzed by the game system itself, and therefore avoiding kind of that recapture that speedrunning goes through. So my second case study was, oh my god, I lost the mouse. Software testing. Software testing is the practice of testing programs for bugs and errors, usually done in a corporate context. Very common is a style of testing known as destructive testing, which are the temporary attempts to break the software in order to retroactively prove that there was a bug that allowed them to break it. Destructive testing is also done in physical testing situations, which I've included via car crash test picture there, but there are many other kinds of testing that include in both physical testing and software testing situations, which I do incorporate to some degree in my chapter. The main focus is on destructive testing and the implications of it. So my methods for this chapter were primarily analysis of various texts related to software testing. The materials included historical academic writing on testing, contemporary academic writing on testing, consumer textbooks, independent textbooks, and qualifications board materials, which no software tester I spoke to has ever cared about, but it serves as an interesting artifact on the web about software testing. I also happen to have worked as a software tester at one point in my life, and while I don't consider that to be an ethnographic study by any means, it does color how I interpret my results and is an important fact to note. So as an inflection point in this chapter, I also use an Alice and Kerich talk to include a discussion of Twitter bots as a different kind of creative breaking that still happens inside of a corporate context, and use that as a comparison point to software testing. So my results for this chapter, I had two kind of key findings. One of them was just tracing the ongoing formalization of software testing from being a practice that was just kind of felt out and based on gut instinct and intuition to a highly taxonomized and quantified field that is also gradually being automated. Most textbooks and consumer-facing materials related to software testing advocate a kind of like felt-out method of software testing, but corporate ownership of testing results and the hairy pace of capitalism kind of lock testers into more and more highly efficient and formalized methods. It's worth considering from a critical breaking standpoint, both these formal and informal aspects. Intuition and gut checks are good models for critical breaking practices and are very interesting, and it's also worth looking at their taxonomies and quantification, possibly for models for disseminating and sharing critical breaking results. Finding the balance between these two, I think, is a really necessary part of building a critical breaking framework. Software testing is also really useful as a case study to show the importance of owning one's own results when it comes to critical breaking. Software testers actually have a very limited analytic range due to their corporate restrictions. Testers can only speak to problems in the software that the company that employs them would consider problems, and actually have to reject their own personal opinions on what might be wrong with a piece of software. Software testers fall into what McKinsey work would describe as, in Hacker Manifesto, as victims of the vectorialist classes. They are unable to act on the results of their own work and instead have it manipulated by people higher up in corporate hierarchy. In order to actually tailor critical breaking analysis to specific values or ideology, which I think is a very important part of what I'm trying to present here, this would be unacceptable and should be avoided in a critical breaking context. So my final case study was hacktivism. The breaking of systems for explicitly political or ideological goals. Hacktivism is usually done with really dubiously legal methods and is tied up in the ethos and legacy of hackers. Because hacktivism is such a broad area containing so many different forms and methods, I thought it was most prudent to focus on just a few case studies inside of this case study and build directly on previous work. As such, my main method for this chapter builds on Molly Sauter's work in The Coming Swarm on the DDoSing tools of Floodnet and the LOIC. DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service, which basically means refreshing a web page so many times that the server gets overloaded and the web page gets taken down. In The Coming Swarm, Sauter analyzes the UI and user-facing functionality of these tools, and my chapter instead focuses on how these tools are coded in the backend. In a future revision, I have my eye on a few more tools to incorporate into this chapter that are related to these two, but at this point, it's just these two. There are two main takeaways for me from this chapter. The first is that in order to develop a breaking tool in a digital system, certain ideological compromises have to be made. There are not that many different ways to produce output in traditional commercial computing situations, and almost all of them are caught up in corporate or proprietary schemes. For instance, the notorious hacking activism group Anonymous uses the LOIC, which is coded in C#, a language owned by Microsoft, and does comprehensive and professional error and race condition handling in the tool. I won't go into what those things necessarily mean, but it reads their source code, despite like the outward tonal irreverence of the tool, which uses a lot of memes and stuff, the way the tool is coded is actually extremely professional. The result of this should not be to reject all possibility of digital breaking for being compromised by corporate programming paradigms, but to be aware of and forward with the ways that these compromises are being made in the tools that we use. The other main takeaway for me in this chapter was that breaking does not need to be convoluted like in speedrunning and software testing it often becomes in order to be effective. DDoSing is pretty simple in concept, and implementation is only slightly more complex, but it still has important political effects and opens up really interesting analytic angles. This is important for helping to scope and plan breaking activities. It's worth considering what the core of a break is and focus on achieving those small goals instead of building complex frameworks to enact them. So looking forward, I include that slide of mathematics as a really dramatic way of presenting the equation for a circle. Looking forward, there are a number of places I can see taking this research. One is just collecting more examples of different ways to break digital systems or different kinds of breaking practices in digital contexts. And I think it would be really prudent to think about ways to collect these kinds of insights and ways to present them, maybe borrowing from software testing's bug reports as a model for that. Another direction would be with these kind of physical systems. Something I considered really early on for this thesis, but ultimately rejected for scoping concerns and streamlining of topic. There are many kinds of interesting non-digital systems that would, with which to apply the same kind of critical breaking thinking. In my mind, there are things like bureaucratic red tape, mathematics, as I spoke about, and general social norms and behaviors that can loosely be considered a system. I include Harold Garfinker's studies in methodology there because of his breaching experiments, which I think are a flawed but interesting way of thinking about this idea. Making these kinds of connections really strengthen critical breaking, as I believe there's a lot of technique and insight to be gained across the arbitrary digital divide as I set up for this thesis. Clearly, I think there's a lot more work that could be done with critical breaking, but I do believe that this thesis is a good first step. Thank you.
That was great. I was wondering if you could repeat what you said about speedrunning's sort of, if I'm understanding correctly, sort of like inherent inability to critique video games more broadly.
Yeah.
Could you tell me more what you meant by that?
Sure. Go back to that slide while I bide your time. So I think what I found with speedrunning is that they're wedding themselves to game design as their core principles of what they do makes it impossible for them to, let me try to remember what I wrote in my thesis. So in order to make a politically interesting statement about games, you need to be able to connect them to things outside of the game itself. Like the game itself as a closed system, you could say maybe interesting things about the way it's coded, or maybe the way like the reward structure is set up in a game or something. But to make it like more politically interesting, you need to have reach and connections to something outside of games. And speedrunning is kind of inside, like commitment to staying inside of the bubble of like what game design is and what the goals of game design are, makes it really difficult. Like impossible is probably too strong, but it makes it really hard to get out of that. Yeah. And that's just the thing that I wanted to avoid. Like the goalpost of success for speedrunning is very fast inside of the game, and that is kind of like a closed loop that it's hard to get out of.
Do you think that the sort of the meme-a-thon one gets a little closer? Like, does it seem to, are those games sort of commentary on the community of speedrunning, or? Yeah,
that's true. Meme-a-thon is like I really don't want to give it too much time because there's a lot of bad stuff about Meme-a-thon also. But yeah, they do get kind of closer, and it is a lot of the ways that they do things were satire, but a lot of them were also just, yeah, I think you can take Meme-a-thon as a way to get out of that bubble. But Meme-a-thon is also like not considered proper speedrunning by the community in a lot of cases, and like they're explicitly jokes and not analysis and things like that, which were all also problems. But yeah, I think you're right.
So we'll jump on to the next case, which is the software testing. Corporations set constraints on what should be tested and what the testers can't test. And so what's your proposition here? To sort of step outside that, but for whom? Like who is the audience that will appreciate this? So Nathan kind of gave us maybe a related argument. Art is the way to sort of confront these practices.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely am on board with that, and that's the thesis comes from a place where I think art is a good way to analyze that. And I think what I was trying to get at with that conclusion, and maybe didn't fully cover in the talk, was that I think it could be really seductive, or it is possibly a compelling thing to try to make this kind of thing into a career, like, or to make it as part of like to have some kind of oversight or committee backing you to do this with like, make it sustainable for you to do it as over the long term and stuff like that. And I'm trying to problematize it by the fact that you do have restrictions coming down from that also. So this is coming towards someone who wants to maybe try breaking things in a critical analytic way, but maybe doesn't have the money to do it. And then I want to dissuade them from trying to make it into like a more formalized thing, or to get Intel to back them or something, like what the problems with that are, through software testing as a case study.
And what would be a venue? I mean, where would that meet the world? Where would that critique resonate?
That's a good question. I think there are spaces where that's becoming more and more of a thing, but it is kind of like maybe jumping the gun on shutting things down. But there are a lot of creative computing things happening, and they're more and more getting attention paid to them by bigger companies, and I think that's kind of where the rubber will be meeting the road on like where those things go. If there's going to be like Intel's core of creative computing people who break systems, or if it's people who do it on their own and share their results in some kind of other format.
And if we were to just, sorry, I don't want to dominate this, but if we were to zoom back and look at sort of existing frameworks like actor network theory or
Yeah.
social construction, is this about interpretive flexibility? Is this about, like, we're wanting to sort of try to understand where these practices, what these practices are doing? Are they contesting a kind of normative given, a product presence? Are they contesting that in a sense that we can read through those kinds of existing lenses, or are you proposing a new space?
I think you can read through those existing lenses, and that's certainly like how I built it a lot, is based on interpretive flexibility and things like that. So no, I would not be positioning this as something that's like a new one of those kinds of frameworks. It is more of a way of organizing a practice of breaking things with some analytical frameworks to better analyze those things. Yeah.
So I have a question about the speed running.
Yep.
Isn't there a form of speed running that relies on glitches to
Yeah.
achieve a faster, and do you see that as operating within the logic or framework of the game?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to get at with, on a micro sense, it is not. But on a macro sense, it's still obeying kind of broader game design things, but on like a point-to-point basis, you're right that they don't. And that's something I struggled with a lot when I was writing this chapter, was trying to figure out where I fell on, is that like truly liberatory, or is that still inside of game design? And kind of where I come down on that is, it is still within game design paradigms, even if there's like moment-to-moment things where things are being glitched or exploited, it still comes back to that central loop inside of speed.
Have any other questions? All right then, thank you.